Hello, welcome back. We will start with lecture 2 today. In lecture 2, we will focus on evolution. Now, in this course, when we talk about evolution, we will be primarily talking about, of course, the evolution of language. Now, evolution of language has been utilized in the various domains of research within this broader area in two ways. One is the ultimate origin of language, as in how language evolved from the time of our primate days, how language started in the first place, and secondly, the gradual evolution of language over time, which is the constant and ongoing change that we that happens over a period of time, which I mentioned in the previous lecture in terms of diachronic changes. So, both of these we will be looking at in this course. However, right now we will look at in the origin, the basic origin more, and eventually as we will discuss about cultural origin of language, we will be focusing a little bit more on the gradual evolution of language, right. Now, the role of evolution in terms of understanding human life on earth, or for that matter any kind of life on earth, is invaluable, as you all are already aware of. So, so much so that it was said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, that is already well established fact of matter in terms of biological sciences, that we need to understand the today's biological entities in terms of how they evolved. Now, the same has been said about language as well. In fact, there has been a parallel drawn by many researchers. One of them, for example, Gibbon said that language too makes sense in the light of evolution. He says that like other biological phenomena, language cannot be fully understood without reference to evolution, proven or hypothesized. Now, this proven or hypothesized is the point where the entire debate and controversies are, and that is what we will be unearthing today. Now, the problem with going back in time with respect to language is that language does not have a recorded fossil. So, when you are looking at biological other kind of biological entities, you find fossils, you have your records, skulls and bones and so on and so forth, and from there you reconstruct. But language is something abstract. As a result, you do not have fossil records. And at the same time, we can think of written records like we have cave paintings and so on, but then those records started much later. Arguably, written forms of language, of any kind of written form, pictograph onward, probably came much later than spoken language. Hence, that is also not of a great help in order to understand how this all came about. As a result of which, as a result of the paucity of evidence, concrete evidence in terms of in comparison with biological entities, that is where the entire controversy is all about. So, let us look at all of them. There are few questions on the basis of which we will try to structure this entire argument. Okay. So, these questions are, first question is, should we study language evolution or not? Believe it or not, even this has been a controversial thing. Whether should it be studied at all, is it at all meaningful to study language evolution, or should we just leave it like that? That itself has been a debate for centuries actually. And the second question is, if we should understand, if we should look at this question, what all should we be focusing on? Out of that, two questions primarily emerge. One is, when did human language evolve, meaning how old is it? What is the time frame of languages in the sense that we understand today evolved? Secondly is, how did it appear? Was it a sudden appearance or did it appear gradually? So, was there one fine day language appeared and humans started speaking, or was there an evolution in terms of other precursors to language which eventually became language that as we know today? These are the two primary domains of questions, and all of these, each of these have been really contentious issues, and one of the main reasons, as we have also mentioned before, that the paucity of concrete tangible evidence is what creates the bigger part of the bigger chunk of the controversy. And often, because in terms of lack of evidence, you have more speculations when you have lack of evidence. So, that is why speculations have created a lot more trouble, and hence the debate has been as rife as it has been. Now, let us start with one by one. First problem is whether to study or not to study. Is it even meaningful to study the origin of language? Now, since the ancient times to the middle age, language evolution of language, how languages came to be was studied in terms of theological from theological perspectives or mostly speculative terms. So, mythological stories are there, how languages came into being, how God created language and so on. So, primarily most of these were speculative terms. Now, along comes Darwin with his origin of species, and this is an event that impacted not only understanding of life forms, various life forms, but this also reignited the entire debate about language evolution as well. So, he stated that if we knew the tree of biological descent of human groups, we could extract the tree relating languages. So, he had a direct correlation between between human evolution and evolution of language. So, that if we can figure out how humans evolved, probably we could also point towards how languages evolved. Now, this reignited a plethora of conjectures, not all of them were supported by scientific evidence. Remember, this is 1800s, 1859 is precisely the time when this theory came out, and so in the many years after that, in the decades after that, there was a lot of speculations. So much so that the speculations were kind of, they started to become kind of outlandish and defied logic, and kind of became a very confusing state of affairs. So much so that there was a decree, there was an order by Linguistic Society of Paris in 1866 that banned inquiry into the origin of language altogether. So, you can imagine the amount of speculations that had no boundaries at all, that had I quote, but with few hard constraints to limit the realm of possibilities. So, this was the reason why the ban was put in place. In many other places also, apart from Paris, the same kind of ban was there, but it was not officially mandated. So, it was kind of unofficial, but largely the understanding was that language evolution should not be studied. So, the primary reason for this was the speculation in absence of scientific constraints. That was the first problem. In the 19th century, Max Muller attacked Darwin's idea on evolution of language, saying that language is uniquely human and cannot possibly have arisen out of evolutionary process. Because so soon after Darwin's theory came out, Max Muller tried to argue against it, saying that this is not how language can be understood. Maybe it is useful for other biological species, but not for language so much. So, because the focus of Darwinian theory was natural selection, and that is what he attacked, and he says this is not possible. So, now the debate was on whether natural selection can be used or not. Now, after a lot of time, almost a century later, the scholarly interest was reignited after a very important conference that was titled Origin and Evolution of Language and Speech. It was sponsored by New York Academy of Science in 1975, a century later. By this time, by 1975, cognitive science was already in its early days, major breakthroughs were happening, neuroscience was taking giant leaps, and so on and so forth. So, now we had the scientific constraints, we had the scientific framework as well as the constraints on the basis of which the theories could be put forward. A short while later, 1990, when Pinker and Bloom's landmark paper came out, the paper was titled Natural Language and Natural Selection. This appeared in the prestigious Behavioral and Brain Sciences. This paper proposed that language evolution need to be understood in terms of biological adaptation. So, this evolved, which is something that evolved out of natural selection. So, not only it was not only Darwin's theory could be utilized, but they proposed that natural selection probably is the way to understand. Following this, a lot of influential publications came out, and cut to today's time, there has been the debate has continued. There are primarily two main groups opposing each other. So, one group says that natural selection is not the theoretical basis on which you should understand language evolution. The other side says that there is no harm in looking at various theories that might answer the big question. So, I quote, one of the proponents that says that it should not be, says that it is very difficult to make a compelling case in favor of natural selection having targeted a particular trait, which is language in our case. Of course, it is easy to spin narrative that implicates natural selection, but biologists like Richard Levitin, who has spent his life constructing compelling arguments and deconstructing just so the stories are basically the natural selection stories that he talks about, have repeatedly pointed out that it takes serious effort to catch natural selection in flagranti. So much so that in case of human cognition, one should give up trying. The whole point of giving such a long quote is that how strongly the this group opposes the idea of natural selection as a possible theoretical construct to understand language evolution. But on the other hand, we have Pinker and Bloom, Jackendorf, Keel, Herford, Dedew, Levinson and a host of other scientists who have attributed the evolution of language to natural selection. This other group, the supporters of it, they advocate coming together of specialists from diverse disciplines to test, falsify and narrow down a number of available hypotheses. So, they say that why do you simply discard the idea, let us sit together, let us have different disciplines sit together and then try to figure out. So, Fitch sums up, the field remain plagued by an unfortunate but persistent belief that scientific work on the topic of language evolution is inherently and irredeemably speculative. This prejudice is unjustified. The reason I am giving you all the course is that to show how strongly and vehemently they oppose each other. On the one hand, it is not just about which theory, but the controversy goes much beyond that. And then just as many other branches of science like geology, cosmology etc., study complex historical processes buried in the past, language evolution can be similarly studied and scientific agreement can be reached based on converging evidence. So, the idea is that just because we are talking about something so very old, going back to antiquity, we do not even know for sure how to what extent, that does not mean we should give up studying, we should give up looking at it from various perspectives, that is the idea. He even disagrees with the way the opposing camp tries to disparage the hypothesis and so on. So, he gives his own ideas about it. Because the strength of any scientific endeavor should be in argument and hypothesis testing and not by letting certain views run unopposed. So, this school of thought has also been strongly opposing Chomsky's group, where they say that it should not be looked at from the natural selection perspective. So, basically now you get a sense of how vehemently the groups have been arguing. So, as of today, because of these various kinds of inputs from different disciplines, today we have, in spite of reservations, a large number of studies, a lot of work has happened, and then we have seen a steep rise also in the recent past, adding to the ever growing knowledge in this domain. So, as of today, now going back all the way to Darwin's time till today, a lot of changes have happened. We have progressed a lot in this area, and today most scholars kind of agree on these few points, that languages did evolve. This is a unique system of communication, different from all other forms of animal communication, and languages developed somewhere between 2 million to 200,000 years. That is roughly the estimate that where we stand today. Now, if languages did evolve, that means there was a protoform to it. So, anything that evolves has a protoform, that means the previous form of it. So, the earlier form, more simplified form of it. So, the same logic should apply to language as well. So, in case of language, this will be called proto-language. So, if languages did evolve, what were the earlier forms, what were the proto-forms? That is another area of research that has seen a lot of contribution of late. The earlier forms obviously need to be simpler than the fully evolved ones. Now, studies in the field of historical linguistics and language change show that languages do change over time. So, the intermediate stages before the full blown language system came into being must have gone through various kinds of intermediate stages, which were basically simpler. Now, was it vocal or was it gesture or was it a mixture of both vocal and gesture, that we do not know for sure. There are a lot of research that has gone into it, which we will be looking at after some time. Now, the second question, Second question is, how old or ancient is human language? Where do we start? When did it all start? Now, this also is not an easy question to answer, as I have mentioned that there has been speculations, there have been earlier there were speculations, now we have various kinds of research output, various kinds of concrete evidence based on which we have newer theories. Now, starting when it all started, since a very long time, the issues of language evolution has been primarily part of religious discourse or theological understanding of the world. So, many religious discourses around the world have looked at this issue, and primarily based on the domain, based on where which religion and which community we are talking about, the idea the language changes, but the basic idea remains the same, which is that God gave us language. So, depending on whichever religion, the God differs and the language differs, but that is the idea. So, in case of Jewish tradition of Midrash, they say that God bestowed a language on Adam, and that language was Hebrew. In the Christian thinkers also, they also believed that if a child is left to himself, he or she will start to speak in Hebrew, because that is the original language. In fact, the idea of Hebrew being the oldest language was so strong that there was a particular Roman emperor who carried out a sort of a quasi experiment on an entire orphanage, and which killed all the children, but this was that experiment was also motivated by the same question, what is the earliest language, what is the one and only first language, that was the idea. In some cases, in some civilizations like the Hindu philosophy, language itself is a divinity. So, in this case, language is the divine language is Sanskrit. So, basically wherever you go, each community had their own way of looking at it, but basically language is a divine gift. So, as a result of which the moment humans came in, language also came with them. So, that is why we call it innate. So, the idea of language being innate to human goes back to the ancient times. However, there are also other strands of thought. There have been other strands of thought from early generations as well. It is not exactly new, which also looks at a non-theological, non-mythological origin of language. One of the most important names in this domain is that of Dante. All of you are already aware of Dante. So, in his Divine Comedy, he discusses the problems of changeability and arbitrariness. So, language, which is what we talk about today, right. So, Hackett talked about it. We all know that one of these arbitrariness is one of the fundamental design features of human language. So, this is something goes back to Dante. He says that language is changeable, language is arbitrary, and this changeability and arbitrariness is part of human language, which became a hallmark of human language after Adam's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So, this is a problem, this was seen as a problem. Now, this is known as the second stage of religious reflection on language. This is called the scholastic phase. In the scholastic phase, so there are two phases. First phase was when language was bestowed on Adam, which is the primal first human as per the Judeo-Christian tradition. He had the language that he spoke was Hebrew, and then after his expulsion, he continued to speak language. However, then the language became, because it was no more divine, the language between the connection between language and thought became sort of arbitrary. That is what Dante was talking about, and this is what was picked up by the scholars later on, and they all talked about this, that the language doesn't remain sort of transparent, it became opaque. So, in the theological perspective, this was called the veil of language. Veil of language meaning that the language conceals the true nature of reality. Among the Christian thinkers, Augustine is an important figure who stated that after the fall of Adam, cognition based on linguistic description is not reliable. This continued for a long time about as far as language and mind connection is concerned. This idea remained there for a long time. This whether language reflects reality or language does not reflect reality, or does it obstruct reality in some sense. So, because the fall from grace meant a permanent breakdown between the word and the thing that it relates to in language. Furthermore, in language itself there is a gap between a word as a mental entity and its external articulation, and consequently linguistic communication is indirect and unreliable. So, this is the second phase of the understanding of language in terms of speculative and religious theological perspective. Now, Augustine's account treats biblical text from philosophical and not from a historical perspective. Now, he was not the first to do this, he also has a precursor namely Philo of Alexandria, and he started this, and this idea continued till the Middle Ages. The main idea behind this was that a man separated from God lives in a world of illusions and imaginations, as a result of which is symbolic of the cognitive and communicative degeneration from the time when he was in the Garden of Eden after and following his expulsion, the afterlife. It was such line of thought that eventually paved ways for studying languages in terms of the relationship with the world, and the speculations about the origin of language or in terms of Adamic languages were sidelined. That was in the past, till the Middle Ages we are talking about. This was followed by the glottogenetic thought, naturalistic origin of language. This idea was, the seeds of this idea goes back all the way to the Epicurean philosophy. However, this was taken up much later in a more stronger way. So, most of the ancient Greeks and Romans believed that language was given to people by gods, but there were traditions at the same time since antiquity centering around a naturalistic origin of language, naturalistic explanation for the origin of language. This primarily goes back to the Epicurean tradition that believed in words were created out of a natural tendency to express certain emotions or concepts. Basically, there was a direct one-to-one mapping. So, onomata was the initial word. So, you express your inner concepts, inner emotions through certain kinds of sounds. So, that was the idea. In the middle, in the 1700s, late 1600 to 1700s, Gian Battista Vico also supported this. In fact, in his The New Science, he presents the hypothesis that the first language, which he describes as the language of gods, did not have a vocal form, but relied on gestures, pictograms, artifacts and religious rituals. So, this is how apparently it all started, but we will come back to it when we discuss about various theories in terms of gestural theories and so on. We will come back to it. In our time, a number of estimates exist as to when human languages originated. As of today, in the 21st century, the speculations are of two types, that it came before the Neanderthals, around the time of the Neanderthals, or after the Neanderthals disappeared. So, did the Neanderthals have language or did they not? On that particular kind of a boundary is the speculations differ. So, some scholars believe that and propose that language suddenly appeared somewhere around 50,000 years ago, that is only Homo sapiens had language. On the other hand, some others propose a deeper timeline for this, claiming that Neanderthals also had some form of language. So, an entire debate around the timeline is now today, as of today, based on the Neanderthal debate. Now, Neanderthal debate, I have added some of the references, you can go and read them in detail. The primary idea here is that Neanderthals, there was a major study that was carried on the Neanderthal project, which looked at from various perspectives, looked at the fossil records and various kinds of reconstructions, and they have tried to figure out whether the Neanderthals had language or not. So, the antiquity of human language often rests on the argument of whether Neanderthals had language. While many scholars do not attribute linguistic ability to Neanderthals, some others do. Based on comparative evidence of the descendants of H. heidelbergensis basically is Homo sapiens, Denisovans and Neanderthals. So, humans, the early humans, they diverted, they changed from the last common ancestors, and between last common ancestors, between the higher primates and the heidelbergensis, there was a break. So, the idea is whether language appeared when the break happened or language appeared further down the line after the Neanderthals, that is the idea. So, the very important, very landmark publication in 2013 as well as 2021 they have reconstructed the based on genetic and other evidence that this group also had some form of language, if not the complex language of today, but there was some kind of a precursor to language that they had. So, as a result of which they proposed a very much longer, much older timeline, that language originated somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. Now, this claim basically is based on findings in genetics, skeletal morphology and morphology of the vocal tract, infant maturation, brain size and cultural artifacts. A large number of studies. In fact, I have added the reference in the list, so you can go and check. So, they claim that Neanderthals and Denisovans had the basic genetic underpinning for recognizably modern language and speech. Some have called it pre-modern language competence, communication computation possibilities, various names have been given. So, at a basic level the genetic structure was in place during the Neanderthal and Denisovan time as well. So, that is the idea, while agreeing that other speech and language would have been simpler in terms of range of speech sounds, complexity of syntax and size of vocabulary, etc. Now, this position has been ridiculed by many, as I have shown before also. This is what was called just so stories take center stage. They simply discarded this whole idea as just so stories. However, today based on more evidence from archaeology and genetics, there are more support for this view, and so much so that when the evidence started pouring in, Chomsky and his colleagues have also readjusted their timeline for language. Now, they say that somewhere around 200,000 years ago language appeared, and updating from their previous stand of 50,000 years ago. So, there is some sort of an agreement between the two groups. That is how old the language origin of language is. The second question is, how did it appear? How did it appear, as in was it a sudden burst of inspiration one fine day, or was there some sort of a process, long drawn out process through which language appeared. So, was it gradual or was it sudden? This is the second line of our contention. So, some argue for a sudden appearance. This idea was based on the findings on the gene called FOXP2. So, FOXP2 was discovered sometime back in 1990s. So, this was once it was discovered that there is a genetic, probably there is a genetic underpinning to language as a skill, then the idea was that okay fine, FOXP2 is responsible. So, whenever FOXP2 appeared first, language appeared, and this was considered to be the very human kind of a tendency. So, but others propose a sequence of mutations and changes with small effects and through intermediate stages useful enough to trigger natural selection. So, we have talked about natural selection before. So, these are the two ideas. Now, this is also not a very simple simplistic this either or kind of an argument, because FOXP2 now has been found out to be present in at least in some form also in the Neanderthals. So, as now you can see how Neanderthals are very important to our entire debate. So, in any case both arguments are based on the biological factors that are considered responsible for the emergence of language. So, within the supporters of biological origin of language, the debate basically centers around whether natural selection could be a pathway to understand language evolution or not. So, was it natural selection or was it a sudden burst of some skill? This also has had its share of controversies and lot of vehement opposing from the two groups, as we have already seen. Now, the other side of the debate is about biological versus cultural origin of the debate. So, on the one hand biological debate, that there are biological factors which gave rise to language as a skill. On the other hand, we have cultural origin hypothesis. So, cultural origin theories primarily look at language as a social skill rather than a biological property of the humans. Proponents of this theory do not undermine the biological factors, of course, biological foundations, but they argue that language is much more than the hard hardware. So, we do have biological factors like the brain structure, the genetic structure, and then the vocal tract and so on and so forth. They all need to be in place. However, language evolved as a part of a social structure, as a social need and so on. So, that is the cultural origin debate. Today, of course, we have a large body of literature in this domain, bringing to light the controversies surrounding the notions of around these two ideas. So, in the subsequent sections, we will look at these issues in detail. So, first we will look at all the biological factors. What are those biological factors on the basis of which the biological origin has been proposed, and then within that also what are the debates. So, now before we go there, we need to understand that this is a domain that is essentially interdisciplinary. There are various approaches to the story, approaches to the question, and they are enriched by evidence and theoretical foundation from a number of disciplines. Some of them are new, some of them are old. The old ones have been around for a long time, linguistics and history and the other such things. And today we also have technologically advanced domains like molecular medicine, molecular biology, many other neuroscience and so on and so forth. So, these are some of the domains which has some of the approaches that have been studied, from where we have drawn our evidence, from where we have drawn our references. So, you can see archaeology, biology, linguistics, psychology, mathematical modeling, molecular biology, paleontology, comparative animal behavior, complex system science and so on. So, that kind of gives you an idea about how complex this idea has been and how interesting has it been that so many different disciplines have looked at the issue from their own perspective, using their own theoretical and methodological finesse. Now, we will start with the biological markers. So, what are the biological markers and how do they match up, how do they really make sense in terms of how languages evolved. So, in this domain we will look at the biological prerequisites of language evolution. Focus will be mainly on evolution of the physical, neurological and or individual cognitive structures required for language, and the debates within the biological premise, sudden versus gradual adaptation or mutation of these things. So, these will be the primary factors within which we will understand the biological domain. Now, biological factor analysis of language evolution takes into account a few structural properties of humans like the brain morphology, vocal tract structure, genetic markers, etc. They are primarily responsible for us to have the skill in the first place, that is the idea. So, what is the skill? Language in our case. So, this domain relies heavily on, for doing so it not only relies on the individual analysis of individual understanding, explanation of those biological features, as in how the genetic structure probably has helped in evolution of language, but also those biological factors are also studied in terms of a comparison to other species. So, comparative analysis between humans and other animals as to why only humans ended up having language, but no other animal, whether it is higher primates or other unrelated animals, they do not have language in the way that we do. So, what happened? So, there will be scholars favoring biological factor do not always of course agree and with the finer aspects of the same. Now, understanding through comparison, that is what we will start with. There are two ways of comparing the humans and non-human other animals in terms of the biological underpinnings and the capability of using language. So, understanding human language evolution involves comparing with other primates. This results in two kinds of comparisons, one is called analogous, the other is called homologous. Analogous structures, these are similar to other animals, but which likely developed independently under different selective pressures. So, they have the similar kind of structures, but probably the motivation behind them was different. On the other hand, we have homologous structures, those shared with our closest animal relatives via shared ancestry, right. So, we will go into a little bit of detail. Analogous structures have the potential to reveal what selective pressure led us to develop language. Now, this is one domain that has been studied a lot in terms of comparing human language with bird song. A lot of research exists, and the bird songs are kind of complex. There is a structured process to it, and how they learn, that there is also a structure to it. So, drawing parallel to bird songs and human language makes sense. Now, this parallel has been connected to sexual selection primarily for birds, this is mate selection, and motivated and reinforced by a specific oxytocin pathways and so on. So, these are the motivation in case of bird song. So, are they also responsible for humans evolving language? That is what we are talking about, right. Some other animals also have surprising parallels to human language. For example, bee dance direction, distance and attractiveness to pollen sources. So, bee dance research on bee dance shows that it is a very complex process. Depending on the way the dance is performed, it talks about it refers to the direction, the distance and the attractiveness of the pollen source. So, a lot of information can be conveyed through bee dance, which can be compared in terms of complexity to human language. Similarly, name calls, clicks and whistles, they are used to refer to specific individuals by some other animals. These animals also show displacement and reflexiveness to some degree like human language. So, these are some other animals that languages as in communication system have been studied in order to understand what are the motivating factors for human language. Do we share the motivating factors or do we not share them, right? And then comes the homologous structures. This is studying homologies of language involve communicative and cognitive behavior of our closest relatives, the higher primates like chimpanzee, bonobo and other kinds of other monkeys and so on. So, we compare and contrast between our language capacity, our biological endowment and their biological endowment and so on and so forth. Now, this can lead us to know what aspect of language was present in our common ancestors. So, that is where we are talking about the Denisovans and Neanderthals as well. This helps us understand what it is about human language that is special and what happened during evolution that resulted in us speaking, whereas our relatives did not. So, communicative behaviors of great apes have been studied a lot in this domain, right. So, studies of animal behavior of our closest relative like chimpanzees have proven that they also do have a very complex natural communication system. So, if you have ever looked at those documentaries on chimpanzees, you will know what I am talking about. They do have, they are a social, they live in societies, they have a very strong social bond, and as a result they have very complex communicative system as well. Right. So, this includes sets of calls, facial signals and gestures. It is a combination of various things, not just calls, right. So, much like us, we use our vocal tract, we also use gestures at the same time and facial features as well. So much so that if you notice, the facial features while speaking differ from culture to culture. So, the American way of speaking when the facial structure, facial expressions and the Indian way of speaking are different. So, that is something that can be traced back to the chimps, so our common ancestors through these higher primates. Some species of monkeys have distinct set of calls which are designed to be deceptive as well. So, some kinds of monkeys have developed a deceptive, they have developed deception. So, we are not the only ones who master in this. For example, a low ranking tufted capuchin monkey may send out a false alarm call to distract others in the troop from a high quality food source, thereby keeping the food to itself. That has been found out in a very important study in 2009. And then studies on captive primates like kanji and Nim Chimpsky, all of you are probably aware of them. These have proven that useful towards understanding how human languages evolved. While kanji showed sensitivity towards word order, Chimpsky did not show any sensitivity to syntax. Why is it important? We will see later when we talk about how syntax, the primacy of syntax in human language as proposed by Chomsky. In fact, the name Nim Chimpsky is a clever play on the name of Chomsky's name. Though such studies have been able to highlight the sophisticated use of communication among great apes, qualitatively and quantitatively they are no match to human beings. However, more and more studies are going on to see find they are not complicated enough, but how did they evolve, that is also important for us. So, that is about homologous and analogous, understanding of homologous and analogous comparison between human and other animals. So, this is where we end our lecture 2. Thank you.